You really think you can hit that? The words cut through the dry desert air, sharp with amusement and laced with doubt. Gunnery Sergeant Miller, 35, stood with his hands on his hips, boots sinking slightly into the gravel of the long-range training field, eyes scanning the horizon as if daring the 82-year-old man before him to fail. Dean Peters adjusted the worn strap of his M40, the leather weathered, the stock marked with gouges that whispered of decades in the field. He didn't speak. He didn't flinch. His gaze, pale and steady, tracked the distant steel plate set nearly 1,700 yards away, sunlight glinting off its edges. The heat shimmered over the range, rising waves of distortion dancing across the sand and metal, but Dean's focus remained unbroken. A younger Marine, Lance Corporal Evans, 21, shifted nervously at Miller's side, noticing the quiet calm in the veteran's posture, the way his old fingers caressed the stock as if reading a language only he understood. The group of Rangers snickered, exchanging glances, their scopes and ballistic computers humming, screens alive with data, all pointing to impossibility. Miller waved his hand, as if conducting an invisible orchestra of disbelief. "You're wasting our time, Pops," he said, voice tight with impatience. Dean's lips pressed together, a faint line, a memory flickering in the corners of his mind. The faint tang of cordite and dust drifted in, carrying him back 25 years to a jungle alive with rain and rot, shouts of men caught in impossible positions, the metallic taste of adrenaline in the air. He had been 19 then, crouched in ferns, a team depending on him, a single bullet holding more weight than any machine's data could calculate. A gust lifted the loose gravel, carrying the sound of distant steel plates clinking, reminding him of the present. Evans caught the subtle shift in Dean's eyes, the barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, the controlled inhale that spoke of readiness, patience, precision. The younger men had not yet realized the old man wasn't just a relic. He was a living record of skills honed under fire, sharpened by years they could not imagine. Dean lifted the rifle slowly, the wooden stock warm under the sun, hands steady as if guided by invisible lines stretching across the range. He squinted through the scope, the target a distant silver speck, the heat waves blurring the horizon, yet he saw every subtle shift, every whisper of wind. The silence around him thickened, even the birds had paused their song. Miller's smirk faltered, Evans felt a chill, the kind that settles deep in the spine when competence speaks louder than words. Dean exhaled softly, a single breath, and the world seemed to hold itself in suspense, the faint hum of electronics and murmurs of the crowd fading into the background. Then he squeezed the trigger, a quiet snap, the air vibrating with the promise of precision. Dust puffed from the base of the steel plate, a gleam splitting down its surface, sharp, exact. Miller froze, his confidence evaporating. Evans blinked, mouth slightly open, and the other Rangers instinctively stepped back, realizing the impossible had just happened, and the old man's gaze remained calm, unwavering, a reminder that skill endures, that respect is not given lightly, and that even time bends before mastery. Dean lowered the rifle slowly, the stock resting lightly against his shoulder, the heat of the morning pressing down, bending the air in wavering lines across the range. Miller's jaw tightened, a faint line of disbelief tracing across his face as he stared at the steel plate, still split from the first shot. The other Rangers shuffled, boots crunching on the gravel, eyes wide, cameras and scopes momentarily forgotten as they processed the precision, the calm control of the 82-year-old veteran. Dean's hands moved with deliberate ease, fingers brushing over worn metal, tracing memories etched into the grooves of the stock, the subtle nicks and dents telling stories of missions long past, skies traversed, and impossible distances measured by instinct rather than instruments. Evans stepped closer, his gaze narrowing on the veteran's eyes, pale blue and steady, reflecting a life of careful calculation and quiet authority, the kind that made hesitation feel absurd. Around them, the range seemed to hold its breath, dust rising in slow eddies, sunlight catching each particle in the warm morning haze. Dean scanned the distant horizon, noting the heat shimmer over the sand, the slight leftward drift of the wind, small details invisible to modern instruments but alive to him, alive in the memory of every day spent reading air and light and distance. Miller shifted impatiently, attempting to reclaim control, waving his hand toward the next plate, voice sharp, questioning, doubting, but Dean's calm persisted, unbroken, measured. A faint smile touched Evans's lips, realizing that the old man was not just demonstrating skill. He was teaching patience, observation, the subtle art of aligning mind, eye, and equipment with a precision born of decades, the sort of wisdom that computers could not replicate. Dean lifted the rifle again, adjusted the scope with meticulous care, breath steady, posture perfect, and the barrel aligned with the distant plate, sun glinting off the polished steel. The air seemed to thrum with anticipation, a quiet energy that built in the space between shot and target, until the first echo of the rifle broke it, crisp and resonant, reverberating over the hills, the bullet tracing an invisible path that split the second plate with such exactness that even the seasoned rangers could not deny the certainty of the outcome. Miller exhaled slowly, a faint tension leaving his shoulders, and Evans felt a pulse of awe and respect radiate through him, the kind that settles quietly but irrevocably. Dean Peters lowered the rifle one final time, eyes sweeping the field, noting the expressions of those around him, the stillness that followed a perfect execution, the unspoken acknowledgement of mastery. He did not smile, did not boast. He simply stood, a silhouette of calm competence, a living reminder that time and experience created depth no arrogance could challenge. The wind picked up, rustling the targets, sending small clouds of sand dancing over the range, carrying with it the quiet testament of skill earned and observed, leaving Miller and the others to process the lesson without a word, the kind of moment that demanded attention, commanded respect, and required silence. The silence that followed was heavy, settling over the range like a dense fog, each ranger frozen in place, unable to fully comprehend what had just occurred. Dean Peters stood with the rifle lowered, eyes sweeping over the split steel plate, the heat of the morning pressing against his back, dust rising in slow spirals around his worn boots. Lance Corporal Evans took a cautious step closer, his gaze flicking between Dean and the reactions of the other Marines, noting the mixture of disbelief, respect, and awe etched across their faces. Gunnery Sergeant Miller, chest tight, hands clenched loosely at his sides, was the last to break the frozen tableau, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the precision, the calm control, the depth of understanding that had guided Dean's shot. The veteran did not speak, did not gesture. He simply exhaled slowly, the sound lost in the shifting wind, and adjusted the scope on the M40 with deliberate care, fingers brushing the worn leather of the strap, tracing the subtle gouges as if recalling every lesson learned over decades. The younger Marines whispered among themselves, voices low, careful not to disturb the aura of mastery that seemed to radiate from Dean Peters, whose posture, though aged, carried the quiet authority of countless missions completed and challenges overcome. Evans noticed the way Dean's eyes flicked from the horizon to the target and back, calculating wind shifts, distances, the slight shimmer of heat rising from the sand, a mental map drawn from instinct and memory rather than instruments. Miller finally moved, a slow, deliberate step forward, not with challenge, but with cautious acknowledgement, the first sign that respect was being earned through action rather than demanded by rank. Dean lifted the rifle once more, testing the alignment, fingers steady, breath controlled, a small cloud of dust swirling at the edges of his boots, and Evans felt the weight of experience in the veteran's presence, a quiet force that filled the space without words. The other Rangers, still slightly hesitant, began to mirror his focus, scanning the range, noting details they had overlooked in there. Initial confidence. Dean's eyes softened briefly, recalling the jungles and hills of long-past missions, the endless calculations made in moments of stillness amid chaos, the invisible lines that guided every shot. The air around the range seemed to hold its breath once again as Dean centered himself, exhaled, and made minor adjustments, each movement precise, economical, a choreography born of decades of practice. When the next shot left the barrel, it was measured, deliberate, and once again the steel plate responded with perfect alignment, a whisper of metal against metal, a sound that carried over the distance, and etched itself into the minds of all who watched. Miller's shoulders relaxed slightly. Evans let out a quiet exhale, and the Rangers stepped back, eyes wide, understanding that what they had witnessed was not merely accuracy, but a testament to experience, focus, and the quiet authority of a life lived mastering a skill that transcends age. Dean lowered the rifle finally, letting the tension drain from his posture, allowing the wind to shift, carrying the faint scent of sun-warmed metal and sand, leaving behind an unspoken acknowledgement that true mastery commands attention without demand, that patience and precision are the marks of expertise, and that in the presence of such calm competence, silence is the only appropriate response. The tension on the range lingered like a slow-moving shadow, stretching across the warm sand and sun-bleached gravel as Dean Peters adjusted the rifle strap, the worn leather soft from decades of use, the metal edges of the scope catching brief flashes of sunlight. Lance Corporal Evans, still standing a careful distance behind, noticed the subtle rhythm in Dean's breathing, the quiet cadence that spoke of experience and focus honed over years far longer than any training schedule could measure. Gunnery Sergeant Miller, arms folded, feet planted firmly, finally allowed a glance around the field, noting the silent recognition passing between the younger Rangers, their eyes wide, faces flushed with astonishment and cautious respect. Dean scanned the horizon, each tiny movement precise, deliberate, as though reading invisible currents of wind and distance, the kind of knowledge that comes not from instruments, but from countless mornings spent measuring the world with nothing more than patience and intuition. Evans's eyes traced the veteran's motions, noting the steady tilt of the head, the alignment of the shoulders, the soft click of the safety being disengaged, all actions performed with the grace of someone entirely in command of the moment. Miller let out a quiet exhale, the first sign that his skepticism was being challenged, and Evans felt the subtle shift, the unspoken acknowledgement of authority that radiated from Dean without a single word. The sun climbed higher, light glinting off the metal targets and casting long shadows that danced over the range, yet Dean remained unmoved, his focus unwavering, hands steady on the stock, eyes tracking minute details that would escape any ordinary observer. A slight gust of wind stirred dust along the firing line, a reminder that nature and circumstance were variables to be considered, and Dean's posture reflected the balance of calm awareness and readiness, each decision measured and deliberate. The younger Marines, despite their modern optics and high-tech calculations, could not anticipate the depth of understanding Dean carried, the invisible threads connecting eye, mind, and target. Evans felt a deepening respect, recognizing that the veteran's actions were not showmanship but mastery, a demonstration of skill earned and preserved across decades. Dean's finger brushed lightly against the trigger, testing alignment, exhaling gently, as if acknowledging the silent audience, the world shrinking to the narrow channel of sight and distance, anticipation stretching taut over the range. The next shot was deliberate, precise, carrying the weight of experience into the air, and the steel plate responded with a crisp, clean mark, dust spiraling upward as the sound echoed softly across the field. The Rangers remained still, breaths caught, eyes wide, the lesson unspoken but undeniable, that true expertise commands attention, patience, and respect, and that skill, honed over a lifetime, is its own authority. Dean lowered the rifle one final time, gaze sweeping over the range, noting expressions and posture, the quiet aftermath of precision, a silent testament that mastery does not boast, it observes, it demonstrates, and it leaves a lasting impression without uttering a word. The air on the range shifted subtly, a quiet energy settling over the small group of Marines as Dean Peters walked slowly along the firing line, hands brushing lightly against the worn wood of his M40, each step measured, deliberate. Lance Corporal Evans followed at a respectful distance, eyes scanning the veteran's movements, noting the careful balance in his posture, the way he carried the weight of years without haste, the quiet authority in his gaze that demanded attention without a single spoken word. Gunnery Sergeant Miller, still standing near the observation point, crossed his arms, a faint trace of tension easing from his shoulders. Watching the younger Rangers exchange glances, their expressions a mixture of admiration and astonishment. Dean paused briefly, scanning the targets, noting the subtle shimmer of sunlight on steel, the faint swirl of dust lifted by the gentle morning wind, and the small, almost imperceptible drift that could influence precision over distance. Evans felt a pulse of realization, recognizing that every microsecond, every tiny adjustment Dean made, was informed by decades of experience, instincts honed in conditions far harsher than this measured training field. The veteran's hands moved with deliberate care as he adjusted the scope, the leather strap worn soft from long years of use, each groove and mark telling a story of careful attention and mastery. Miller finally spoke, his voice low, steady, acknowledging the unspoken authority in Dean's presence, and the Rangers fell silent, watching, learning without words, absorbing the lesson imparted through motion and focus rather than instruction. Dean exhaled softly, a slow, controlled breath, and lifted the rifle once more, eyes narrowing as he aligned the sights, calculating the influence of wind and distance, the imperceptible variations that only a practiced eye could detect. Evans shifted slightly, sensing the tension in the air, the collective focus of the group converging on the veteran, a shared understanding of the skill and dedication displayed in each precise movement. Dean's finger hovered lightly over the trigger, testing alignment, acknowledging the weight of the moment, the expectancy that had settled over the field, and the Rangers watched as the veteran demonstrated mastery not through speed or force but through patience, precision, and unwavering focus. The next shot left the barrel clean and measured, and the sound carried crisply across the range, dust and tiny fragments shifting at the impact point, the steel responding exactly as expected. Miller's expression softened, a trace of respect replacing skepticism, and Evans allowed himself a small, quiet smile, recognizing that they had witnessed more than accuracy. They had observed a lifetime of knowledge distilled into a single, deliberate action. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint scent of sun-warmed metal and dust, and Dean lowered the rifle slowly, scanning the range, noting the expressions of those around him, the quiet acknowledgement of skill, and the unspoken bond formed through observation and shared recognition of mastery. The group remained still, absorbing the full measure of the veteran's presence, understanding that patience, experience, and calm determination commanded respect more effectively than words ever could, leaving a lasting impression on every observer without a single declaration, a quiet testament to the enduring power of skill honed over decades. The sun had climbed higher over the range, casting long, wavering shadows across the gravel and steel, yet Dean Peters remained calm, a steady presence amid the quiet awe of the younger Marines. Lance Corporal Evans observed every subtle movement, noting the careful way Dean adjusted the scope, the gentle tilt of his head, the alignment of his shoulders, as though every motion were a lesson in precision and patience. Gunnery Sergeant Miller took a step back, exhaling slowly, the tension in his chest easing as he acknowledged the undeniable skill displayed before him, a lifetime of knowledge distilled into careful, deliberate action. Dean's eyes swept the field, taking in the position of each target, the shimmer of sunlight on metal, the faint dust drifting from the gravel, his mind calculating angles and distances with instinctual ease, informed by decades of experience that no modern instrument could replicate. Evans noticed the subtle smile that crossed the veteran's lips, almost imperceptible, a hint of satisfaction in the perfection of execution, and he felt a deepening respect, understanding that mastery is often silent, powerful, and unassuming. The younger Marines murmured softly among themselves, voices low, careful not to disturb the concentration that seemed to emanate from Dean, who moved with a fluid grace, touching the worn stock of his rifle, checking alignment, inhaling slowly, eyes sharp and steady. Miller shifted, attempting to mask the awe in his expression, yet his posture softened, shoulders relaxing, hands unclenching, as he allowed himself to absorb the lesson imparted without words. Dean lifted the rifle once more, making minor adjustments, the air warm and dry, carrying the faint scent of sun-baked metal and dust, and the field seemed to quiet further, as though the earth itself recognized the gravity of focus and skill before it. Evans felt a quiet thrill, sensing the intangible connection between mind, eye, and instrument, the kind that only comes from practice, patience, and deep understanding. Dean exhaled softly, aligning the rifle perfectly with the next distant steel plate, the light catching the scope in brief flashes, and then released the shot, crisp and measured, echoing clearly across the range, dust rising, the plate responding with a precise mark, a testament to the veteran's unwavering command of his craft. The Rangers remained still, expressions a mixture of astonishment and respect, absorbing the demonstration of skill that required no explanation, no showmanship, only calm, deliberate mastery. Dean lowered the rifle, scanning the range, noting every reaction, every small change in posture, the quiet acknowledgement of experience and expertise settling over the field, and Evans understood that this was more than a demonstration of accuracy. It was an unspoken lesson in patience, observation, and the enduring power of skill honed over a lifetime. Miller finally nodded slightly, a subtle sign of respect, and the younger Marines exhaled, realizing that the veteran's presence had reshaped their understanding of focus, mastery, and the silent authority of someone who had spent decades perfecting what they could only aspire to achieve. The wind shifted again, carrying faint trails of dust and heat, and Dean Peters stood with quiet satisfaction, the embodiment of skill and discipline, leaving a lasting impression that needed no words, a testament to the calm, enduring force of experience and knowledge. Dean Peters stepped back from the firing line, letting the rifle rest lightly in his hands, the sun warm on his back and casting long, rippling shadows across the range. Lance Corporal Evans observed closely, noting the subtle shift in the younger Ranger's posture, the way their shoulders relaxed yet their eyes remained wide, a mixture of wonder and cautious respect reflecting across their faces. Gunnery Sergeant Miller stood slightly apart, arms crossed loosely, his expression softening, a trace of admiration replacing the skepticism that had lingered since the beginning of the morning. Dean's gaze swept over the field, lingering on the steel targets, the faint shimmer of dust rising with every light breeze, and he allowed himself a slow exhale, the kind that measured satisfaction and focus in equal parts. The younger Marines whispered among themselves, voices low, careful not to disturb the calm authority radiating from Dean, each glance communicating unspoken acknowledgement of skill and mastery. The veteran lifted his eyes to the horizon, tracking the subtle patterns in the wind, the warmth of the sun bending the light across the distant hills, and his mind calculated trajectories not with instruments, but with instinct and decades of experience, each decision precise and deliberate. Evans stepped closer, careful to maintain respect, and noted the rhythm in Dean's posture, the small tilt of the head, the alignment of his shoulders, the way he carried the rifle as though it were an extension of himself, every motion. Economical and exact. Miller finally exhaled, a quiet acknowledgement of the depth of understanding and control displayed, and the Rangers fell silent, absorbing the unspoken lesson imparted through observation alone. Dean bent slightly to adjust the scope, his fingers brushing the worn leather, tracing the subtle marks and nicks that spoke of years of careful use, each a reminder of missions accomplished, challenges met, and the disciplined patience required to master precision. The breeze lifted a thin line of dust along the firing line, and Dean's eyes followed it briefly, accounting for variables invisible to modern technology, but clear to an experienced observer. Evans felt a profound respect growing, recognizing that Dean's mastery was not just a demonstration of skill, but a display of patience, awareness, and quiet authority earned over a lifetime. Dean raised the rifle once more, aligning it meticulously with the distant plate, the weight of experience settling into every calculated motion, and exhaled slowly, a deliberate pause that drew the attention of every observer on the range. The shot left the barrel clean and exact, the sound crisp, and the steel plate responded perfectly, a small puff of dust rising from the base, and the Rangers stood motionless, absorbing the lesson without need for explanation. Dean lowered the rifle finally, eyes sweeping across the field, noting reactions, postures, and expressions, a quiet satisfaction in the mastery displayed, the wind shifting gently, carrying the warmth of the sun and the faint scent of dust, leaving behind a lasting impression of skill, patience, and the enduring authority that comes from experience. A reminder that true mastery commands respect silently and powerfully without a single word being spoken. Dean Peters took a deliberate step back from the final target, the warm morning sun casting a golden haze across the range, highlighting the faint dust that lingered in the air from the previous shots. Lance Corporal Evans remained close, observing the subtle sway of Dean's posture, the way the veteran carried the rifle with ease and familiarity, the lines of experience etched into his movements, every action economical and precise. Gunnery Sergeant Miller shifted his weight, the initial disbelief in his expression slowly replaced by a quiet, measured respect, his arms loosening from the defensive cross over his chest as he watched the younger Ranger's glance between Dean and the steel targets, a silent conversation of astonishment and acknowledgement passing among them. Dean's eyes scanned the distant hills, noting every imperceptible shimmer of heat, every slight drift in the wind, the faint variations in light that would escape untrained observers, and adjusted the rifle strap with careful precision, his fingers tracing the worn leather, the subtle gouges, each mark telling a story of decades spent mastering the art of marksmanship. Evans felt a wave of understanding pass through him, recognizing that the veteran's skill was not the product of technology or force, but of meticulous observation, patience, and a depth of knowledge accumulated over a lifetime. Dean moved slowly along the range, every step deliberate, absorbing the soundscape, the faint hum of distant engines, the rustle of sand over gravel, the shifting wind, integrating it into his awareness as if it were part of the calculation itself. The younger Marines followed cautiously, careful to mirror his attention, noting how every adjustment, every tilt of the head, every pause carried intent and focus. Miller finally spoke, his voice low, acknowledging the unspoken mastery displayed before him, and the group collectively allowed a brief moment of quiet, the range itself seeming to settle in recognition of the skill demonstrated. Dean paused at the center of the field, taking a measured breath, eyes scanning every angle, every subtle change in environment. The rifle balanced lightly in his hands, and Evans caught the faint flicker of a smile that hinted at satisfaction without arrogance, pride without boastfulness. The steel targets shimmered in the light, dust rising gently as a small gust brushed over them, and the silence that followed was thick with unspoken understanding, the kind that imparts respect without words, the kind that teaches without demonstration. Dean lowered the rifle, the warm sun, reflecting off the worn stock, his gaze sweeping across the observers, noting the stillness, the awe, the subtle shifts in posture, and the field remained quiet, charged with the acknowledgement of true mastery, a testament to decades of focus, patience, and precise knowledge, leaving every young Marine with a lingering impression that excellence is quiet, authority is earned, and skill endures beyond age or expectation. The afternoon sun began to lower, casting long, warm shadows across the range as Dean Peters finally rested the M40 against his shoulder, the rifle cool and familiar in his hands. Lance Corporal Evans stepped closer, his eyes reflecting a quiet admiration, noting the calm steadiness in the veteran's posture, the way every movement seemed measured, intentional, and effortless. Gunnery Sergeant Miller exhaled slowly, letting the tension leave his shoulders, a subtle nod acknowledging the mastery before him, and the younger Rangers exchanged glances, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Dean's gaze swept over the field one last time, noting the precise alignment of the targets, the faint swirl of dust that drifted gently in the warm breeze, and the glint of sunlight on steel, all details observed and understood with ease. He lowered the rifle fully, hands resting lightly on the worn stock, and allowed himself a small, satisfied exhale, the kind that comes from work done well, from skill demonstrated quietly but undeniably. Evans felt a deep respect settle within him, recognizing that this moment was not about competition or display, but about the quiet authority of experience, the kind that commands attention without words, that teaches through observation rather than instruction. Miller glanced around at his team, noting their softened expressions, the subtle shift from doubt to appreciation, and he finally spoke, his voice calm and measured, acknowledging the lessons silently absorbed by all who had watched. Dean took a slow step back, eyes lifting to the horizon, tracing the distant hills, the shimmer of heat over sand and gravel, the gentle movement of dust, all of it a reminder of the precision and awareness required to master even the simplest tasks with excellence. Evans mirrored the veteran's gaze briefly, the field quiet except for the soft whistle of wind, feeling the weight of the demonstration, the enduring impression left by someone who had honed skill over decades, who carried knowledge and focus as naturally as breath itself. Dean shifted slightly, adjusting his stance, and allowed a faint smile to cross his lips, not for pride, but for the quiet satisfaction of sharing, silently, the essence of a lifetime's experience with those who had been fortunate enough to witness it. The sun dipped further, bathing the range in amber light, shadows stretching and bending, and Dean finally turned, walking with deliberate calm toward the edge of the field, each step measured, purposeful, yet relaxed, leaving behind the stillness that had grown over the course of the morning, a silence that spoke louder than any words could. Evans and the Rangers remained in place a moment longer, absorbing the final imprint of the veteran's presence, the lessons of patience, precision, and the quiet power of mastery etched into memory. As Dean moved away, the wind carried faint whispers of dust and sunlight across the range, and the field seemed to exhale along with him, the echo of skill and experience lingering in the air, a reminder that true mastery is quiet, authority is earned, and respect is measured by observation, patience, and the calm assurance of a life lived with purpose and focus.